Hello everyone! In this video, I'll be showing you how I created this vintage style book cover. I'll show you my entire process, including the book construction, adding texture and paint to the cover, and also creating the collage on the inside of the book. The first thing that I'm doing is measuring out the 3 pieces that I need to construct the cover. I used another book that I have as reference for the sizing, and the dimensions that I ended up using were approximately 6 by 9 inches for the covers and 1.5 inches by 9 inches for the spine. I then cut down my pieces using an X-Acto knife and a ruler. As long as your X-Acto knife is sharp, this should create fairly precise cuts. So now that I have all 3 pieces of my book cover, I just need to attach them together. So I cut out a piece of paper that's a little bit wider than my spine, and I'll be using that as my connecting piece. So I glued down the spine to the center of that piece of paper, and then I also glued down the other 2 covers on either side, and I left a little bit of space in between the spine and the cover, and that will make it easier to open and close the book. The material that I used for the connecting piece is actually cut out from a paper grocery bag, so I think it should be fairly sturdy. When I can, I try to repurpose items that would otherwise go in the trash, especially materials that are part of packaging. So for this project, I tried to only use supplies I already owned or materials that I could find around the house. I then cut out a second connecting piece that is the same size, and I'm gluing it down on the opposite side so that the 2 connecting pieces are facing each other, and this will make sure that the book is sturdy on both sides. And then I'm using my bone folder to smooth out any of the creases, and I also make sure that my book is able to open and close without any issues. And now we have a really sturdy base for our book. From here, you could really decorate this any way you like. This is where we can get super creative. For this book, I decided to add a little hole in the front cover, and this is going to act as a window that shows a sneak peek of what's inside. So far, I haven't added anything to this book yet, but my plan is to include some phrase or title on the first page that you'll be able to see through this window. Next, I wanted to add some texture to the cover, so I took a piece of leftover tissue paper and cut it out to the size of my cover, and then I'm just crumpling it up to add some texture. I applied some PVA glue all over the cover, and then I gently placed the tissue paper on top, and I made sure that I didn't smooth it out so that all of the texture in the paper remains. At this point, I felt like the book could use even more texture, so I decided to add a second layer. I trimmed away the excess paper around the edges, and then I repeated the same steps with a second piece of tissue paper, and I just glued that on top of the first piece. The texture of the tissue paper definitely adds an interesting effect. It kind of looks worn out, and it almost looks like leather, even though the book itself is completely hardcover. I really like the effect that this creates, and it'll look even better once we've added some paint. To finish off the tissue paper, I just folded it over on all 4 sides and glued it down. And since the tissue paper is covering up the window that I created earlier, I just cut out a hole in the middle, and then I created 4 little flaps, which I also folded over the edges. Now it's time to add some color. So I actually did a couple of tests to see what kind of painting technique I wanted to use. On the left, I tried layering different colors of paint, and on the right, I tried mixing the paints together. and I preferred the one on the left, so I decided to use that technique. For the base layer, I used black and brown acrylic paint, and I'm just letting them mix together as I'm painting. I will admit that this painting process did take me quite a while. It took several layers of paint until I was happy with the result, but I wanted it to look a certain way. I kind of had a vision in my head of how I wanted it to look, and so it took me several rounds to get to that point. When I went back to look through the footage, I think I ended up having a couple of hours of footage that I had to edit through, so this one definitely took me a little bit longer, and I think it's mainly because I was just paying close attention to the details, but I do feel like it was worth it because I am really happy with the way that it turned out. So after finishing the base layer, I felt like it was a little bit too dark for me, so I went over it with a layer of brown paint, and I'm trying to paint in a way that you can still sort of see through to the previous layer, and that will help create more dimension. I did skip ahead a few layers of paint since it was fairly repetitive, but I basically just kept painting until I was satisfied with the base color. For the top layer of paint, I knew I wanted to add some sort of gold. So I had two different gold paints. One of them was the Deco Art Emperor's Gold, and the other one was Lumiere True Gold, and both of them are metallic acrylic paints. I did tests with the two colors, and I preferred the Emperor's Gold because it was more of a warm tone, whereas the other gold was a more yellowy gold. I'm applying the paint with a really thin layer using a dry brush, and I also have another brush that is slightly damp, and I'm just using that to help spread out the paint evenly across the entire surface. After the first layer of gold paint, I felt like it could use more gold, so I ended up adding a second layer on top of that, but I still made sure to keep the layer of paint fairly thin so that you could still see the colors underneath. I also made sure to paint the edges as well, since those will be visible. And this is how the final color turned out. Here I'm painting the inside of the cover. I am going to be decorating the two sides, so most of this won't be visible, but I almost forgot that the inner spine is actually going to be exposed, so I just wanted to make sure that the color matched up with the front of the book. So now I'm going to be creating the insides of the cover. I cut out two pieces of paper that are the same size as my covers, and these will act as the base for the collage that I'm going to create. Since the front of the cover is fairly uniform, I wanted to create something that's more visually interesting and busy on the inside of the book. So I decided to create a collage using scraps from paper pads and other papers that I have. I'm planning on using this book as sort of a travel journal where I will store some of the travel ephemera that I collect on my trips. I did keep that in mind when choosing papers for this collage. I wanted to incorporate some travel themed papers throughout. So you can see that I added some maps and some postcard themed papers, but it's not too overly travel themed. I just included some elements of that throughout the collage. Since the front of my cover is already very neutral, I felt like adding a collage on the inside is already a pretty big contrast, and if I were to incorporate a bunch of different colors into that collage, I feel like it wouldn't really go together well and it would just be too much of a contrast. So I decided to stick with only neutral tones for this collage. Once I was happy with all of the placement, I would just trim off all of the pieces that were hanging off of the edges using my paper trimmer. One thing that I was considering was adding some stitching to this collage. I thought it might look kind of interesting and create sort of like a quilt-like look, but I ended up not doing it. I was already happy with the way that it looked and I had already spent quite a while working on it, so I didn't feel like it needed anything else added and I didn't want to mess it up. But I think that could have been an interesting idea, but I just decided not to do it for this particular project. And now for the final touches. I'm actually sealing in the book using some Mod Podge. You could really use any sealant, but I think Mod Podge works just fine. Adding this layer on top of the book is going to create a smooth finish, and when you hold the book it'll just feel a lot nicer and you won't have that chalky feel from the paint. It'll just feel like a real book, which is really nice. You can be pretty generous with the Mod Podge in my opinion. I'm also applying it to the inside cover, and this will also act as the glue where I'm going to be attaching the collage that I created on the inside. One thing that I noticed after attaching everything together was my book cover was starting to bend ever so slightly inwards. It was probably from all of the layers of paint that I added. The cover was just starting to buckle just a tiny bit, and it wasn't a huge issue, but I was able to fix it pretty easily. I just placed a heavy book on top of each of the covers and let it flatten out for a couple of hours, and that completely fixed the issue. And that is the completed book cover. This is probably one of my more ambitious book covers that I've created, but I really love the way it turned out. I hope you enjoyed watching the process. If you did, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'd love to have you here. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.